The Children by W. Baker Evans. If you would sleep soft, unwary reader, or after a page or two drift into sleep, this is not the tale for you. Turn on, we beg, for here is no bedtime story, but a sombre, witching tale to haunt the uneasy pillow and conjure spirits from every shadowed corner. Mr. Gillespie despised travel agencies. When he travelled abroad, he made out his itineraries himself. Sometimes his plans went astray. The sort of predicament he found himself in now was by no means new to him. Stuck on a lonely by-road somewhere in southern Europe, his taxi, if you could call it that, wheels up on the grassy verge, the engine in pieces in the dust, and the driver scratching a greasy forehead in a token of bewilderment. Mr. Gillespie sighed and looked at his watch. It was just past noon. He climbed out of the ancient vehicle, perspiring a little in the hot sun. He was 50-ish and plump, and approached the driver. He knew nothing of the language, but by pointing at the dismembered engine and the dial of his watch, he got the man to understand what he wanted to know. In similar manner, he got the answer. It would be 2 hours at least before they were able to move. Mr. Gillespie sighed again and looked about him. There was little to see. The white road was hedged close by dense green woodland, rising gently on one side, falling away on the other. The shade of the trees looked cool and inviting. Mr. Gillespie got the satchel containing his sketching gear out of the back of the cab, slung it over his shoulder, and set out for a stroll. To his surprise, the driver made an attempt to stop him. An oily hand gripped his wrist. Urgent words were hissed at him. Anxious eyes gazed into his. Mr. Gillespie was impatient. He shook off the hand, said uselessly in English, "Don't be a fool, man, I'll be back in an hour at the most," and moved with determination towards the wood. The driver shouted after him, but he paid no attention, and soon road, car, and driver were hidden by the trees. There are woods, and there are woods. Some are mysterious, some threatening, some friendly, some aloof. This one, Mr. Gillespie summed up after a few minutes as benevolent. True, it was very silent. No birds sang, but the silence was peaceful, not menacing. There was no undergrowth to impede his progress, no weeds or brambles, just soft, mossy grass, and the smooth trunks of the trees, evenly spaced and rising sheer to branch out in greenery far overhead. What they were, Mr. Gillespie did not know. He was no botanist. But their shade was soothing, and here and there they led through little shafts and bars of sunlight to paint the forest floor with patches of gold. It was all very pleasant. Presently he came to a clearing, and there was a fallen log to sit on, and a convenient tree to lean against, and the sunshine, brighter here, made fascinating shadow play with branches and leaves across the clearing's grassy floor. Mr. Gillespie sat down and drew out his sketch pad. He worked happily, head on one side, fingers busy. What the scene lacked, he decided after a few minutes, was human interest. Ideally, there should be a small boy in a red jumper sitting at the foot of that tree, Mr. Gillespie looked up from his labours and nearly jumped out of his skin. A small boy sat at the foot of the tree, solemnly regarding him. Certainly he had no red jumper, but he wore a curious, sack-like garment, which covered him from shoulders to brown, scratched knees. But a warm, solid flesh-and-blood 10-year-old boy he certainly was. The boy grinned, showing white teeth. Then he got to his feet and confidently advanced until he stood looking down at Mr. Gillespie from a couple of feet away. Mr. Gillespie observed with distaste that he carried in one hand the blooded remains of some small, furry animal mangled by a trap or beast of prey. Following his glance, the child smiled and tossed the offending object away. He pursed his lips, threw back his head, and gave a long, clear whistle. At once, 3 more children materialized before Mr. Gillespie's astonished eyes, moving out from the shadow of the trees as silently as Red Indians. 2 boys and a girl, all about the same age, all dressed in sacking shifts, all brown-skinned, bright-eyed, and flaxen-haired. Calmly they regarded him. Then the girl stepped forward, stretched out her arm, and squeezed Mr. Gillespie's leg gently just above the knee. Satisfied, apparently, by this physical contact, she stepped back and spoke a brief and unintelligible sentence to the other 3. Immediately, they were all convulsed with laughter, open-mouthed and shrieking, tears in their eyes. Their laughter died as suddenly as it had begun, as suddenly as children's laughter will, and they sat round Mr. Gillespie in a half-circle, watching and solemn once more. Mr. Gillespie was not entirely at ease. In the first place, he found the concentrated gaze of 4 pairs of eyes discomforting, and secondly, there was the annoyance of his total inability to communicate. He smiled. Their faces didn't alter. He held up his unfinished sketch so that they could see it. They showed no comprehension. Suddenly, inspired, he reached into his satchel and pulled out a bar of chocolate. He broke off a piece and put it into his mouth. Perhaps they had never seen chocolate before, and offered the rest to the girl. What happened next was so disconcerting that it was several moments before Mr. Gillespie could take any effective action. The girl took the chocolate, smelt it, bit, and munched. Instantly, the boy next to her shot out an arm and tore the chocolate away. The girl screamed and flung herself on him, and in a second or 2, the small bodies were locked in deadly struggle, clawing, biting, tearing, throttling, rolling over and over on the grass. "Stop it!" cried Mr. Gillespie, recovering himself and jumping up. "Stop it at once!" This had no effect whatever. The boy's fingers were at the girl's throat. Her nails ripped at his cheeks. Desperately, Mr. Gillespie seized the boy and dragged him to his feet, to be astounded at the strength with which he wrenched himself free. Then, in a second, it was all over. The boy relaxed. The girl scrambled up, laughing. And suddenly, Mr. Gillespie found himself caught up in a sort of whirlwind dance. A child gripped each hand, and round they rushed in a circle, a mad ring of roses, the children shouting out with glee, leaning outwards, heads back, bare feet pounding the turf. Mr. Gillespie was soon giddy. He huffed and puffed, and tripped and stumbled, and tried vainly to release himself from the clutching fingers. He succeeded at last, and sat down abruptly, mopping his moist brow and waiting for his thumping heart to quieten. Again the children formed their silent semicircle. They were hardly breathing heavily, Mr. Gillespie noted, let alone panting as he was. Once more he felt a gentle squeeze above the knee. It was a boy this time, and again came unintelligible words, but no laughter, just solemn watchfulness. It was time to get back to the car. Mr. Gillespie rose to his feet. The children stood their ground, intent and still. Then the little girl moved forward, pursing her lips, and raised her arms to be lifted up and kissed. Mr. Gillespie was touched. He picked her up. Her arms slid round his neck, and from between those rosy lips, shockingly, came breath as fetid as an animal's. The green eyes stared into his, and suddenly terror, wild, unreasoning terror, flooded Mr. Gillespie's very soul. He screamed and tore at the encircling arms. They were immovable. He screamed again, and even as he did so, the fair head dipped forward, and the white teeth closed on his throat. Avid hands wrenched at his ankles, and he fell, all four on top of him. For a little while he threshed and struggled and screamed once more, chokingly. But soon there was no more movement or sound, except perhaps the scrape of strong young teeth on bone.